Time's River by Jim Lee. Chapter 2, The Swan. Alice. Next met I a swan, lovely girl. She'd set, I thought, my heart a-whirl, so smooth and white, so pleasing to my eye. But no sooner had I spied her, marched duck sisters up beside her, to conceal her from me they sought to try. You are from us too different, pugnacious and so abhorrent. It is to laugh you'd set sight so lofty. Then they as one their backs did turn, and my noble affection spurn, thinking me perhaps some sort of softy. Not so easily dissuaded, I their social club invaded, a snort with rage as bull in china shop. Seizing a nearby willow switch, I set to them with fevered pitch. Fled they all my fierce countenance, full stop. But as settled, deathly quiet, I saw I'd been fool to try it, for the gentle maid had panicked and flown. At once seeing facts astutely, my course I set most resolutely, and continued down the beach on my own. The oldest trick in the book, Paul said. Paul was my best friend at the time, or at least I wanted him to be. He was roughly the same height as me, but he was a year older and in the next grade. He was the cool kid in the neighborhood. He had older brothers, one of whom was a football player, and Paul played football too. I say I wanted him to be my best friend because, although we did lots of things together, he never really seemed to need me to be his friend. He was his own person, and if what I wanted to do fit in with that, that was fine with Paul. Later in life, I came to the conclusion that in every relationship, one person always cares just a little bit more about the relationship than the other. I guess, looking back, that was true even then. I had told him, after swearing him to secrecy in the charming way children have, "Stick a needle in your eye?" what had happened to Phil. I'd also told him about the other thing I forgot to mention before. In the basement at my house, there was a low place in the floor. Underneath a piece of reinforced plywood, tiled over to blend in with the rest of the floor, there was a small hole. I guess it must have been for drainage. There was some kind of pipe in the bottom of it, but I used it for hiding stuff. Nothing that anyone but a child would find of interest, to be sure. Just some of my favorite things. Things I didn't want Eddie to get his mitts on. I didn't think he knew about my hiding place yet. Eddie was just starting a phase of wanting to follow me around, and it seemed he found everything I did fascinating. And this went for my things as well. I guess he was the one who cared a little more in that relationship, at least back then. By the time I had grown up enough to appreciate that brotherly connection for the important thing it really was, it was almost gone. The positions were neutralizing, perhaps even reversing. Nowadays, it seems we only ever really get together for holidays and such, and whenever I think about those days when he used to want to tag along, I feel almost overwhelmed by the sense of lost potential. Sometimes I think he feels it too, but with a sense of righteous indignation rather than regret. Perhaps that I should have been a better big brother, and that he's glad he doesn't need me anymore. Oh well. But this brings me back to the thread at hand. For the day after the thing happened, I had found a small piece of wood in my hiding place. It was a piece of wooden plank about 1 inch thick, maybe 4 inches wide, and 9 inches long. One end was an old but clean cut, clearly made with a saw. The other end was jagged, looking like it had been broken by impact. All the kids had seen guys breaking boards on TV with karate. I thought it looked like half of one of those boards, but the wood seemed old, older than the boards which made up the framework of the flooring around my hiding place. Into this piece of wood someone had cut, well, gouged is more like it, for the marks looked like they had been made by pounding a screwdriver into the wood. The gouges spelled out a single word: lost. I had asked Eddie without telling him where I had found it, if he had ever seen this thing before. And he either didn't know, or he had a bright future as a poker player. I saw nothing on his face but the kind of interest he might have shown at anything I shared with him. There's no way that my parents would have done it, and no one else lived in the house in those days. Mom's friends didn't have any kids, and when Dad's old buddy from the Air Force came over to play pool on the big table in the basement, all the kids were advised to make ourselves scarce, in so many words. Yet the item had definitely not been there before. Part of being the cool kid is the fact that it seems to come with an almost inarguable sense of worldly wisdom. The oldest trick in the book, man, Paul repeated. Guy's trying to make moves on your mom, blows his top when you call him on it, and he takes a poke at you. He exhales a jet of air upward toward a long curl hanging in his eyes. I think he does this as much to clear the hair that's bothering him as to lend disregard to the man about whom he's speaking. He just does this without thinking. That's part of what makes him cool. So he freaks out, thinks he's going to catch it when she sees you're bleeding, and bugs out, he assures me. By the time you wake up from getting knocked out, he's ski-daddled. If anyone asks him what happened to you, he'll probably say he didn't see you out there at all, he finishes with a smirk. But what about the shark face? I wasn't knocked out. He looked all crazy, I protested. Nah, of course you were knocked out. You said your mom came and woke you up, right? Yeah, that's true, I said, really not knowing where else to go with this, but still convinced I had seen what I saw. See, it is pretty funny, though. He does kind of look like a shark with them teeth. He pulled back his lips with his fingers to mimic a grotesque caricature of Phil's smile. Hey, little lady, how about some sugar? I grimaced at that, then broke into snickers in spite of myself. Paul could always make me laugh. He had seen Phil on one of his midday visits when we were swimming in our pool. I was one of only 2 families in the neighborhood at that time who had pools, and the other one belonged to 2 girls who were just snotty to everybody. Satisfied he had made his point, and ever the practical boy, he said, "Besides, if he ever shows his face again, you can tell him to get lost or you spill the beans. Who do you think she'd believe, him or you? Plus," he grinned, "give me a call, and while he's talking to you guys, I'll let the air out of his tires," he said as he slapped me on the back. Okay, I relented, but then remembered, wait, what about the plank? Man, you know Eddie did that. You're going to have to find a new place to hide your stuff. And as easily as that, the magic of friendship blurred out the sharp terror. I always admired the way Paul could do things like that. It's part of why I always felt like I needed him more than he would ever need me. I'm sure modern psychology could spin all manner of suppositions about the significance of those feelings, but they'd all be wrong. It was very simple. He was the cool kid, and for someone as reserved as I was, I felt lucky and grateful that he was my friend. For a little while. The rest of the summer is faded in my memory to the same background haze as so much of my life. I should mention that one of the other things I have noticed about myself is that I have a poor grasp of linear time. I used to tell people that I wasn't good with time, but later on I came to understand it better. If the time or date of a thing is part of that thing, I remember it perfectly. The year we went to Disney World was 1980, for example, but I don't remember the year. I just remember that my parents took us to this huge outdoor event, kind of like a Christian version of Woodstock outside of Orlando during the same trip. It was called Jesus 80. They had a bumper sticker they brought back from it, and it stayed stuck on our van for years. But without that event having the year in the name, I wouldn't be able to tell you when it was. But that's to come yet. When they taught us the concept of positive and negative numbers in school, they used a number line. They showed 0 in the middle, and arrows representing infinity in both directions, positive and negative. Around the same time, it seems, they started using number lines in history class to place dates in chronological sequence for us to memorize, always moving in one direction. First this happened, then this, and this, and this. Most people who will talk to me on the subject seem to file things in their heads the same way. To me, time is more like when, in the movies, they're showing some detective trying to figure out how to crack some baffling case, and he's got all of his clues and fragments of clues pinned up to a big bulletin board, and he's been up all night running bits of string or red yarn, they seem to like red yarn, between the various pushpins, trying to literally connect the dots to find some pattern. That's how time feels to me. Like I'm the overtired PI trying to make sense of it all before some looming thing happens. Whether that's the bad guy getting away, or the kidnapped girl dying, or even the PI himself dying from some slow-acting poison. So that summer has a few pushpins in it. Happy days in some ways, but things were getting worse at home. My parents hadn't yet found religion, so they were still smashing the crap out of things when they'd get drunk. Actually, I think it was more Mom than Dad doing the smashing, to be honest. But that's only second-hand data. Eddie and I were always tucked away in our beds when these things happened. Well, almost always. I remember playing Star Wars in what at that time seemed like a vast expanse of woods that bordered our neighborhood. Han and I made forts, had epic space battles, at one time or another jumped into the garbage compactor, which was just a muddy, swampy patch along a boggy brook lined with skunk cabbage, while yelling, "Shut down all the garbage batches on the detention level!" When space adventures paled, though not often, our lightsabers reverted back to the pirate cutlasses they had been before that May, and making a treasure map and burying my cache of possessions in a hole in the woods, in somewhat higher ground than the skunk cabbage, of course. I didn't bury all my things out there, oddly enough. Most of the things I liked least out of my pile from the basement, and chief among these was the mysterious plank with "Lost" stabbed into it. Because I didn't want to sleep with that thing near me, but I didn't want to lose it either. I couldn't have told you why. The summer ended, and the treasure map went into a little wooden chest at the bottom of my toy box. The chest had been filled with caps that came with cap pistolas and the cutlasses in a pirate toy set. The caps were long gone. We had exploded most of them by smashing full rolls of them with bricks, when someone discovered that the sound made by that was much more satisfying than the one-at-a-time snap, snap, snap. And of course, when the caps were gone, we just shouted blam anyway. I had kept the treasure chest rather than put it in the ground because it was too small to put the plank in, and besides, it was pretty neat. It was made of real wood and lined with felt and had brass fittings and a lock. They were really only pot metal, not brass, but I learned that later. And at the bottom of the toy box, it lay forgotten as time slid along that infinite number line. In the fall of 1977, I returned to school as a fourth grader. I know when I graduated, so I can count back from there. My memory of that year has heavy blurring and pink eraser dust all around it, because for many years I thought of it as when things went off track, and I wanted to forget. My parents got saved at some point during that school year, I think, and so around that time they stopped drinking and smoking weed, which they had been growing in the garden in the backyard, though I had never known what it was, and started going to church. And of course, Eddie and I got to go too. Prior to this, only I had been going to church. Mom had felt it was an important tribal social badge. You needed to be able to say, when asked, that you belonged to something. Otherwise, you could become outcast. They would drop me off at a local Episcopal church by myself every Sunday morning. There was no children's Sunday school either. I would just sit there in the emptiest pew I could find and entertain myself by playing with whatever small toy I could conceal in a pocket as I was being prepared for church. When it was over, they had snacks, apple juice and Vienna Fingers cookies mostly. I scarfed as many of these as they would let me get away with. Then someone would come and get me. Same routine every week, like clockwork. Mom and Dad getting saved changed all that. I was bitter about the period that immediately followed for a long time, mostly because I only saw it through the lens of my own needs and wants. It wasn't until I faced the hard stare in the mirror of myself as an adult who had to live with consequences that I understood there was more to it than that. They had been at each other's throats, killing themselves slowly with the booze, with a chance of killing themselves quickly when they would go off on one of their ever more frequent psychotic breaks. So in that way, changing to Jesus as drug was really a profound improvement viewed in the long term. Here's the thing. I have at least one major thing in common with them. So does Eddie. None of us ever do anything in a half-hearted way. Oh, sure, if we're undecided on something, we may hover around the periphery, making our decision, but once that decision is made, we give it everything we've got. And so they did. It started, as such things so often do, with a knock at the door. Jehovah's Witnesses spreading the word of their angry, vengeful God. And with them, my father. It being the weekend, it is likely enough that he was thoroughly baked, and thus philosophical, and discussing his understanding of the high points of theology with them. I believe they had spoken to Mom first, a neighbor with a big "I found it" blue dot in her front bay window. Though, like most housewives of that era, all big decisions had to be countersigned by the man of the house before any deal was agreed to. And so the JWs had made a return visit to convince them both while he was home. However they managed the pitch, before long, Mom and Dad were sold, provisionally. They got themselves what they thought should be the authoritative version of the Bible and started reading, still toking all the while. It wasn't until they got to a scripture about the law bearing not the sword in vain that they had their first pangs of guilt about the weed, and so it was immediately gone. Like I said, no half measures. But of course, soon there were found discrepancies between this version and that version. Questions were raised, answers were proffered and rejected as insufficient. Before long, a soon-to-be familiar scene played itself out for the first time as my father stormed out of the church, shouting his admonitions as he went. They were alone. They had been sold on God, but no imperfect man they could find was able to show this God to them. And so a righteous quest was born. They would seek out the most perfect version of the truth, and where others had allowed their truth to be diluted or twisted to fit their own preferences, Mom and Dad would cut aside the fat, to the bone if necessary, and let the chips fall where they may. Once they found this truth, naturally, they would be honor-bound to share it with the world, as it had been originally intended. To do anything less would be to knowingly abandon their fellow man to ignorance and desolation. I can see the rationale quite clearly. Now. I am no longer certain what I truly thought or felt in my heart at that time. What I know is what I did. I joined with them to the best of my power in their quest. I passed out pamphlets with them, and was grounded for getting ink on the pool table while stamping the name and phone number of the church they formed on the pre-printed tracts they had received in boxes. I went door to door and told my neighbors that they were going to hell, and that only Jesus could save them from what I assured would be a horrible fate. As that school year bled into the next, I preached to the other children at school and told them, I have no doubt, much the same, and was sent to the principal's office. My parents were called, and the school discovered that they faced a united front. Whether I believed everything, or only wanted to believe everything so I could be the good son they wanted me to be, their little preacher boy, I honestly do not know anymore. Sometime in the summer of 1978, Paul was baptized in our pool. My cool friend was now an apostle, mayhap, and though he was not the only neighborhood kid who was, he was the only one I relied upon. We preached together. During this time, Mom and Dad had not been idle in their own right. They had used paint and magic markers and covered our vehicles with scriptures. They had taken all the televisions in the house, and in a public statement condemning the evils of a decadent society, smashed the screens in with bricks and left them in a heap in the front yard as a testament for the world to acknowledge. My father had access to a supply of the sheets of fabric-backed mirror squares they used to make disco balls. A large cross was constructed and swathed in this material and affixed to the rooftop where the television antenna had been. He did not, however, retain the antenna rotating motor mount. Thank heaven for small favors. At least we did not stoop to poor taste. A public address speaker was installed in the van, and my family spent countless hours trolling the streets of the nearby cities, shouting at people. In retrospect, having watched some of this year's fall lineup, I may need to reevaluate my feelings on some of those events. But I digress. It is important for you to understand that I am no longer bitter about these events, though I was for a long time, as I have said, for many years. Indeed, the events I have experienced have caused me to have my own unique interpretation of the divine, the reason for which will be shown as my tale continues to unfold. And this has provided me the corrective lens I needed to view this chapter in my life more clearly. They felt they needed to do more. In addition to the homeless people they might bring home and bathe, they opened up their home for foster children to share their love and message with the young as well. And as the state was then wise enough to do, the first two they sent were angels, bright, well-mannered Southern Baptist angel brothers, one ginger, one blonde. The elder was, if that were possible, an even more vociferous evangelist than myself, and with his Southern twang added in, sounded not unlike Alfalfa from the Little Rascals. He even looked like the little bugger, but for the shock of red hair. Oh, he was absolutely adorable! Again, I know this because I have been told that it was so. Okay, perhaps there's still a smidgen of bitterness left in that one corner. I only want you to see me, smaller and younger than all the children around me, because I had been skipped ahead a grade in an effort by the educational system to reward such native talent as they thought I had. Me and my friend Paul, who became my protector, my confidant, my ally, as the frequency and amplitude of shouts of "Jesus freak!" and "Holy roller!" and even "Satan lives!" that one would make me cry, continued to increase, I was safe. Our scriptures told us that one would put 1,000 to flight, but two could put 10,000 to flight. And sure enough, whenever I was with Paul, the jeers would quiet to no more than whispers. Whether this was because cool kids are simply invincible, or because his oldest brother was a bruiser with a notorious reputation, I didn't know and I didn't care. The more they persecute you, the scriptures told me, the more it is because they see him in you. And my parents were proud of me. They weren't trying to kill each other anymore, and they were proud of me. Yes, I had competition now for my parents' love, but what of that? I had my best friend by my side, which is all any boy could ever ask for. Who cares if the rest of the world thinks I'm a joke? I have shared all this so that you can see me, if you will, at that apogee. For that is when Paul learned his family was moving away. Paul finished the school year, and then he and his family moved to Atlanta. I cannot say that the attacks began immediately after he left. A day, or perhaps even two, might have passed before the onslaught commenced in earnest, but it did indeed begin, and from the time it did, the outcome was inevitable. Day after day, I continued to try to play my role. My larger classmates, sixth graders by now, pushed me, shoved me, took my backpack, mocked me, threw things at me, day after day, week after week, month after month, relentlessly, every day, every single day. Fast forward to the late spring of 1980, with summer just around the corner and the trip to Disney World and Jesus 80, either in the immediate future or the immediate past. That distinction is blurred away now. And that was when the levee, as they say, broke. There was a girl, Alice, who I had secretly liked for years. In the days before Jesus came into our lives, I remember sitting on the step in her driveway, watching her play hopscotch. She had been kind to me then, and though real desire was some years in my future yet, I still found pleasure in the attentions of a pretty girl. She spent very little time outside, normally. I never learned why, so this memory is a rare one. As a result, some might have called her pale, but she seemed not so to me. I thought she looked delicate and graceful, like a china doll, or perhaps a swan. At school, I dreaded recess most of all. Under the watchful eye of the teacher, Even the boldest of my assailants felt the need for restraint. Many complaints had been made about the various incursions, but these seemed only to embolden my enemies, for nothing was ever actually done to them, so far as I could tell. And the school administration seemed, in an unspoken way, to feel that this was evolution sorting itself out, and withdrew their concern. But outside in the playground, with the children left to our own devices, all bets were off. Usually, I would make for the corner of the fence, away from all the playground equipment, and simply try to remain unnoticed until the bell called us to return. But on this day, no one was on any of the swings. I climbed onto the swing and began to pump my legs, higher, higher. I just wanted to be happy again. I just wanted to be carefree again, to relax again. I looked up from my thoughts and saw that a group of kids had gathered in front of me. All around the swing set, it seemed. I couldn't see directly behind me, but I heard harsh laughter from that quarter, and I knew what that sound meant. It meant that some second stringer was egging on the real problem. I became convinced someone was behind me, moving into position with a sharpened stick, and that with the very next swing back, I might be impaled upon it. In my mind's eye, I saw this pike burst forth from my chest and did the only thing I could do. I leapt. I hadn't slowed down first. I jumped at the maximum height I had been able to attain. The series of images that came next were a jumble, even then. I only knew that in their midst there was another sharp click, and I knew I had bitten my tongue again, and I was on my face in the dirt. Raucous laughter surrounded me. I turned my face upward, and directly before me, with her hands drawn up to her face, was Alice. To either side were her new friends, who had come from another elementary school which had closed a few months previous, hag-faced gutter snipes both. I reached out my hand, speaking no word, but only asking for help with my eyes. She made a furtive glance to either side, and then her normally placid face twisted into a sneer. "Smooth move, Jesus freak," she said, and backed away. Her friends closed in from either side, blocking Alice from my view. "Yeah, smooth move, Jesus freak." I didn't hear anything else. I stood up. I felt dizzy and nauseous, and my stomach was doing loop-de-loops. I felt like I was riding a roller coaster. I felt weight in my right hand and looked down to see a bullwhip. Looking back up, I heard no words, but the gutter snipes were still yammering away soundlessly. They looked like ducks, some kind of bird anyway, with their beaks just flapping open and closed. Rage unlike anything I had ever known heretofore coursed through me, and I let fly with the most foul invective I could compose, despite my conspicuous lack of practice, as I cracked the bullwhip. Only a single word, the F-bomb. Apparently that was sufficient, though it never occurred to me to wonder how I knew how to crack a bullwhip, since I had never seen one before in my life, especially without blinding myself in the process. I reveled in the look of terror on their birdy faces as they quailed before me. I now could actually hear quacking, and I began to laugh hysterically. The bell rang, but several children had already ran to summon the teacher, and I was led to the principal's office, where my bullwhip was pried from my grasp. The principal was haranguing away, himself looking distinctly penguin-like, while he waited for the secretary to reach my mother on the phone. Distracted, I lost interest and began to stare at the ceiling.
"Are you even listening to me?"
he shouted. I looked back at him, and only the subtlest hint of penguin genetics remained on his face. Across his desk lay the combination lock and chain from my bicycle. I would later hear that I had appeared to sleepwalk from the playground over to the bike racks, unlock my bike, and walk back to the same spot on the playground before turning on the children, who innocently insisted that they were only following me to see what was wrong with me, and then I had brandished the chain like a weapon. My mother arrived. I was brought home and grounded to my room for a week. When I returned to school, they had made arrangements for me to see the school psychologist. The day my grounding ended, I went into my closet. I dug down to the bottom of my toy box and found what I sought, the treasure chest. It was still locked. I had no idea what had ever become of the key. I went to the kitchen and got a screwdriver from the tool drawer and went back to my room. I pried the little hasp, and it snapped easily, revealing then the base metal which had been coated to give the brassy appearance. I retrieved the treasure map. Though the appearance of much of the woods had changed, the landmark I had set as the starting point was inviolate. 2 old automobile carcasses which had been abandoned here when this was nothing but some farmer's field, for the smaller one on its side had a decent-sized tree growing in the passenger side door and out the driver's side. I looked at my compass and faced due north and began counting paces. 72, 73, 74. Turn right 90 degrees, go 48 paces. 46, 47, 48. At my feet, I could see the spot. Even though the yellow grass of the field had grown over it, there was still visible a slight depression where fill that had been lost to shoveling wildly in all directions had not been entirely replaced in volume by the treasure. Nothing I would have found without my map. I chunked the shovel I had brought into the dirt at my feet and began to dig. After a few minutes, I unearthed the box. Inside, atop the pile of forgotten items, lay the plank I had found in my basement years before. On it, the familiar gouged letters read, "Lost." And now, beneath that, in fresher marks of the same type, "Eyes."